have someone to talk to. The loneliness of being an elderly person and waiting for someone to visit with you, and talk to you and be interested in your life. To me, it's fascinating because they all had interesting lives, and I loved talking to them. And so, it's just I wasn't afraid at all. I mean, it was fun. I mean, nobody pulled a gun on me or a knife on me. I mean, although I'll tell you a fast story. I interviewed one man, and he had a bodyguard. And the man that I interviewed, I won't even mention his name, was late 80s. And then he walked away. He could hardly walk, and he walked away from me. And he had been a killer in his youth. He stopped, and he turned around, and he came back to me, and I was standing up. And then he started poking me in the chest with his finger. Listen, kid. I mean, then I was in my 40s. Listen, kid. He says, if anybody gives you a tough time, you tell me, and I'll take care of them. And I didn't want to burst out laughing. Here he could barely walk, but after talking to me, it projected him back 50 years in time when he was this young thug. The word was starker, muscle man, and when he was not afraid of anything. And he was going to, if anybody gave me a tough time, this guy was going to go and take care of it for me. So, no, it was not frightening at all. And as a matter of fact, I always looked forward to it because the stories that they told me, you could not find anywhere. And I always double-checked everything. I mean, wherever I could with sources. And a lot of the things that they told me and things in certain ways, I found later on in FBI files. So kind of, not that the FBI files are, the Torah from Sinai and all that stuff, but, I got corroboration wherever I could. Wherever I could not, when they told me intimate things like Polly Adler, the famous Jewish madame who wrote a book, and then there's a movie about her, a house is not a home kind of thing. They told me stories about her and the Jewish, the gangsters that would call up and ask for women to be sent over to such and such a hotel and things. Well, who knows about that? I mean, they didn't publish it in newspapers and things, but so I put those kinds of stories in my book with quotations around it, and I cited them at the end. And I wrote it the way they told me, and they used colorful language. So, yes, there were Jewish criminals, and there were a lot of them. There also, Jews were very heavily involved in the international prostitution trade. Yiddish-speaking women brought to many places like Istanbul, Constantinople then, and in North Africa and South America and other places, and Jews were involved. And I didn't want to write about this, but Arnold Rothstein and some of the others bringing over heroin and cocaine from Hong Kong and other places, heavily involved in that. Jews did everything. It wasn't just white-collar crime. It's not Bernard Madoff and all these other people. They did bad things. I mean, everything they did all of it, whether it's extortion and contract killing, drugs, robbery, whatever, kidnapping. They did it all.
I want to make the distinction that you make in the book and the things that you notice culturally between the Italian families and the Jewish families in the mobster paradigm. There were differences, and one of them you talked about was that the Jewish mobster absolutely did not want the children to inherit that line of work. Is that correct?
They didn't pass it on. That's right. And they did not bring them into the business. Their business, quote unquote, that's what they called it, was separate from their family life. I did not interview one person or ever read about anybody, any of these gangsters, that brought their relatives, their sons, grandchildren, whatever, into the business. They did not. The Italians did. That's why you have what they call Italian families. The families, their cousins, their relatives, they make it the godsons, and they bring over people in the family from Sicily. They keep it in the family. Jews never saw it. With them, it was one generational. That doesn't mean there haven't been Jewish criminals after that period, but these people did not bring their children into the business. Meyer Lansky's sons were not in the business. One of his sons graduated West Point. And when I spoke to him, he was very proud of his son. He told me about it. He said, "Did you know my son graduated West Point?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." And others as well. And I have so much evidence for the fact that they tried everything to keep them out of it and to divorce them from this. Even willing to go to jail, as you heard of, he's famous, Annenberg.
Yes.
Okay.
Talk about that. Talk about that, though.
Right,
Share that.
Yeah. And his father was involved with Capone and others in the newspaper. They caught him, and he was sent to jail, and he had to pay a huge fine. And then it was the largest fine ever paid, $2 million for income tax evasion. And Moses Annenberg was his name, and his son later on became, extremely wealthy, TV guide and all that stuff. And one of the deals that he made with the government is he would confess to everything and go to jail on the condition that they did not, prosecute his son. He said, my son was not involved. I do not want him, in any way connected with this. And they agreed, and he went to jail, and he got cancer, unfortunately, and he died. But that was very typical of it. And the children suffered because of their father, what he was doing. They knew. I mean, they were not stupid because people talked. It was in newspapers. But their children, it's very interesting, the third generation, they think it's the greatest thing. I've had students who tell me stories about their grandmother being a prostitute, and they're American students that come to Israel, and I get, they come up to me and they tell me all these neat little stories, and or their grandfather being in such and such a mob. To them, it's folklore. The second, there's an expression they use in history. The third generation wants to remember what the second generation wanted to forget. And for the third generation, it's folklore, it's history, it's way back when, So for them, it's fascinating. It's folklore. But the second generation were embarrassed, they were humiliated. When I interviewed these old-time mobsters, I said, are you sorry for what you did? I've got them on tape saying, none of them said they were sorry for what they did, but all of them said that they were sorry that it caused shame to their family, that it humiliated the family. That doesn't mean they got out of it because of the family. But the thing that they really were, ashamed about or upset about or sad about was that it impacted on the family despite all their efforts to keep them out of it. They're not sorry for what they did, but they are sorry that what they did ended up shaming the family and humiliating them in the Jewish community and all this kind of stuff. Many of them changed their names and I even had to change names in the book where people told me very secret kind of things about the family, and then they implored me. I could use the material, but please not use the name. So I would change names, and the people who knew these individuals and the gangs they were in would write me or call me and say, well, so-and-so, where'd you get that name from? They weren't in the gang. And then I say, well, the name was changed from something. So you have that element, the shame. Very much awareness of shame. There was no pride in it. The gang, it's nothing against Italians, but there was certain kind of status. Look at John Gotti and these people, I mean, the Teflon Don, and he dressed up, and he was all... Jews didn't do that. Some did then, but the ones who survived the longest were the ones who did not draw attention to themselves, like Meyer Lansky or Modalitz, and even Longies Willman. And some of the others, that they knew that if you draw attention to yourself, you're going to jeopardize your business venture.
How did these guys, these mobsters, protect their families, though? Because eventually people do find out you have children, you have wives, etc. How did they provide for their security? How did they protect them?
Yeah, they said they're businessmen. And then the family gets shocked when they're arrested, like Lepke Buchhalter and some of these others, and go to jail. Jake Guzik, who's Al Capone's treasurer, his grandchildren and his children and all this got letters that they wrote to each other when he was in prison. Of course, they were censored by the prison authorities. He reminded them to say Kaddish, the memorial prayer for the prayer for the dead.
Yes.
When it's the time, all this kind of stuff. They did whatever they could, and they always, and even when they were interviewed in newspapers, they were saying, "Hey, businessman." And you say, well, are you serious? They didn't know. They didn't, psychologically, if you don't want to believe something, you don't believe something. No, he's a businessman. He's not a crook. Oh, come on, that's typical FBI. That's typical, anti-Semitism, that they hate us. They're looking for a reason just to, attack the Jews. No, he's not a businessman. And then later on, there's a famous gangster, Waxy Gordon, That wasn't his real name. It was Nam de Wexler is his last real name. And they called him Waxy because he was a great pickpocket as a young man. You know, his fingers were like wax. He would just be able to, well, you know, he was arrested and thrown in jail and stuff, paid a huge fine and all this kind of stuff. And he was married to the daughter of an Orthodox rabbi. She didn't know what he was doing. Had a son in medical